A scene in Mounds Park, probably pretty similar if we went out here today. I took this at least 10 years ago. It was on one of those November Indian summer days that we enjoy here in Indiana. And I went out there to take pictures partly for this presentation. If we could turn the calendar back 100 years, you would see an entirely different scene than you're seeing here today in Mounds Park. I call today's presentation the story of the Mounds Amusement Park, 1897 to 1930. We're all familiar with the great mound that's in the park. That is the attraction to Mound State Park today. We know a little bit about its history. Well, we know quite a bit about its history. We know that archaeologists have come in and done some excavating, and from some of the carbon dating that they do on burnt wood, which is amazingly accurate, they have been able to determine that that great mound was begun in the year 160 BC. Not a burial mound. The Native Americans, whose names we don't know, they are prehistoric, would have religious observances and other kinds of celebrations on the mound itself, and this was reserved for the chiefs and the shamans of the tribe. These would be the rest of the tribe scattered around, and my wife and I had an opportunity several years ago to go out there for the summer solstice, and the Miami tribe of Indiana came up and they performed a ceremony out here, and we stood around and watched that and swatted mosquitoes. I remember that very, very, very well. Also in the park is the Circle Mound. The first recorded fact relating to the mounds exists in the form of a survey made by the United States government in 1821, the mounds being distinguished as the mound. You see, in 1818, 3 years before, the United States government concluded a treaty with all of the Native Americans living in Indiana to leave. Reason being, 2 years prior to that, 1816, Indiana had become a state, and they wanted the Native Americans to leave so that the settlers could move in and begin to populate the area. Once that treaty was concluded and the Native Americans, for the most part, had left, surveyors came in to see what did we get in that treaty. What did we get? The land which now embraces Mounds Park was sold by the government grant for $1.50 an acre in 1830. How many would buy $1.50, pay $1.50 for an acre of ground out there today? Title to the land changed hands several times and finally came into the possession of Frederick Brandenburg Jr. And this is that survey map done in 1821. And you see right here my arrow points to the word mound. The surveyor found it. That would be, I assume, the Great Mound. And he put it on his map. Mr. Brandenburg's home, an old picture on the left and a modern picture on the right. This is the Brandenburg family in front of it. He is the son of Frederick Brandenburg Sr., who was the first of the Brandenburg family to come and settle in Madison County. And they had a cabin in the park. Then the son built this substantial brick home later on around 1840. Today, visitors to Mound State Park enjoy the quiet and serenity of the trails that wind through the beautiful landscape of the crown jewel of our county. Those are my words. I consider Mounds Park to be the crown jewel of all Madison County. I really do, and those are my words. But visitors to the park in the early 20th century found a much, much different look. Yes, the famous mounds, the stately trees, and numerous hiking trails were there, but an amusement park occupied about 60 acres or so near the Great Mound at the southern end of the park. Open only in the summer months, it was extremely popular. Located on the scenic bluff 75 feet above White River was an attraction that was the destination of people from not only the local area, but also from Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, and Muncie. Ladies, I want you to pay attention to how the ladies are dressed. You will see throughout the presentation today several images of women who visited the park at that time, and I think you'll take interest in how they are dressed. Don't know whether this is a spring or fall photograph. No foliage on the trees, so we can't tell which it is. But anyway, this would be down near the area where you come down from the main park, where the old drinking fountain was located. Basically, the park encompassed, the amusement park encompassed, this is roughly 60 acres of the entire 256 acres of Mounds Park. Some traveled there by personal transportation, such as automobiles, which were not very numerous, or they came in horse and buggy. They were charged 10 cents to park their buggy. And we have this picture showing the people parking their buggies. I don't know where they've pastured the horses, but they're somewhere. This is the entrance that was originally at the park. It is directly opposite where the Great Mound is. Today we go further down and come in and come back to the Great Mound, but the original entrance was in this area. Others chose to ride the interurban cars operated by the Union Traction Company of Indiana. A round trip from Anderson cost you a nickel. Children under 12 rode for free, and admission to the park was yet another nickel. The cars would stop at an open waiting station complete with jukebox to depart passengers and then loop around for a return trip to Anderson. An amazing photograph. This is the trestle that carried the interurban or street cars into Mounds Park from Anderson. This is roughly 75 feet. Several years ago, when I was putting all of this together, I spent a lot of time in the park office. I wanted to go through everything they had. So we got things off the shelf and blew the dust off of them, and I sat out in a room all by myself, and for a week I did nothing but read and take notes. What I was reading in part were interviews that had been conducted by one of the park naturalists of people who had patronized the park years ago as children. They're now adults when they were interviewed, and they had fascinating stories to tell, and much of what I'm going to tell you today comes from those interviews. But one interview that I found that was most interesting, and I found this more than once, was this. When the car would leave Anderson for the trip to the park, you had a motorman who operated the vehicle, and then you had, or the car, and then you had a conductor. And he had a change purse on his belt. You'll see that later on. But he would collect the nickel. And what I found in what I researched was that several people from time to time would just not pay the nickel. He didn't say much about it. But when the car got out here, he told the motorman to stop. And then he went back to the individual and he says, well, you now have a choice. I'll take your nickel or watch that first step. It's a dandy. And I believe he collected every fee that he was owed. When the car pulled into the park, it came to this waiting station. You see a person sitting here and a child. There was a jukebox in here playing music. It was a place where you could take shelter waiting to take the return trip back to Anderson, or if the car came from Newcastle, Muncie, Fort Wayne, they also hooked into the interurban line from there and went back there. But this was a place where you departed and then also arrived. It all began in 1897 when the traction company acquired use of the property from Frederick Bryanberg Jr.'s heirs and began installing attractions. The property was formerly leased by the UTC in 1905, and for approximately the next 23 years, the park was a magnet for people seeking fun and relaxation. Over the intervening years, new attractions were added and others removed. Knowing exactly what was there and when is difficult to determine. Fortunately, individual memories of the park were recorded, as I told you just a moment ago. Several years ago, Jody Heaston, the former interpretive naturalist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, assigned to Mound State Park, conducted interviews with persons who remember the early days of the park. From those collective interviews, a picture emerges of what it was like. And this is a map that I found in going through the information. This was a map that was drawn by a man by the name of Cap Bronnenberg, and this is his memory of the park that he recalls when he was there. Of course, we see the Great Mound here. Merry-go-round, monkey cage, bowling alley, skating rink, hamburger stand, and the station that I just showed you. Balloons, bandstand, miniature train ride that just looped the Great Mound is all it did at that time. There was a roller coaster, a pavilion, and then you could go down to the river, and along the river there were boat rides and so forth along the river. So there was a lot to do. That was Cap Bronnenberg's recollection of what the park looked like. Also in that collection was another map drawn by a man by the name of Charles Bungay. His is different. They're both right, it's just at different times and different ways the park was constructed. Permanent, of course, in all of those was the Great Mound, the Pavilion, and the Leap the Dips roller coaster. Foremost in everyone's memory was the roller coaster called Leap the Dips. The famous ride began in operation in 1908. It was a wooden structure, painted white, estimated to be about 3 stories tall. It cost 5 cents to ride, as did all the other park rides, or for a quarter you got 6 rides. It was located on the ground between the Great Mound and the river bluff. Many who rode it tell of being able to see the river below as the cars raced. Remember that. These are from the interviews. Raced around the track near the edge of the bluffs. Not long before it was torn down, 2 people were killed when they stood up in the fast-moving cars. Remember that. This is a picture that we have of the Leap the Dips coaster. It was a figure 8 configuration, and the cars went around the 2 loops, rose to them and went down. I'll show you here in just a moment. You can see where the cars went up and then they circled around and came back down. Picture taken by somebody who got on the track to show you the cable system that took it to the top. And then this next picture is probably my favorite of all of the coaster pictures. See if you don't agree. Dated 1911, you see 1/2 of that figure 8 construction. The rest of it would have come like this. When I was doing the research for this, I got a phone call. It was from a lady that lived in Fort Wayne. And she introduced herself and she said, "I understand you're doing research on the Mounds Amusement Park." Yes, she said, "Well, my aunt has a lot of memories of that park, and she would like to talk to you." "Okay," I said, "where is she?" "Well, she is a resident of Bethany Point in Anderson." I asked her name, and she told me, and she said, "Feel free to go out there and talk to her." So one Saturday morning, my wife and I called and made arrangements, and my wife and I went out to visit her. And we sat all Saturday afternoon, and she told stories of what she remembered as a little girl in the park, and it was fascinating. I asked questions, and she could answer everything that I asked. Enjoyed it so much, along about 5 o'clock, they came to get her for dinner. So that was the end of that, but I wasn't done yet. So I said, "Could I come back another Saturday?" "Why, sure," she says. So I came back another Saturday. So I spent 2 Saturday afternoons with her, picking her brain, letting her talk, letting her reminisce. One of the stories that she told me was that as a little girl, when I asked her, I said, "What was your favorite ride?" She said it was the Leap the Dips coaster. I said, "What was it like?" "Oh," she said, "scared me to death." Scared me to death. She says, "I'd get on that, my heart would start beating, pretty soon it was up in my throat." And I said, "Well, you're so scared, you only rode it once?" "Oh, no," she says, "I rode it every time I could ride it." Her name was Hilda Anderson. And she was the wife of Harold Anderson, who was an attorney here in Anderson for a number of years. The day that I met her, she was 99 years old. And she had a memory that was unbelievably sharp. Remembered everything, every detail of her life at 99 years, a remarkable person. You see, this is 40 feet from the top to the bottom to the ground, and then this overlooks White River, which is another 76 feet below. So these cars that raced around here, she told me, she says, every time I went around that curve, I was sure I was going to die. Sure I was going to die. I asked her, well, Hilda, how fast did that car go? She said, I have no idea, but she says it's the fastest thing I was ever on in my life. I found out that in Lakemont Park, Altoona, Pennsylvania, there is another Leap the Dips coaster, which is, according to former interpretive naturalist Angie Manuel, a twin to the one that was here. It was built in 1902 by Edward Joy Morris, the same as ours. It is a figure 8 type. It's 1,980 feet long and it's 41 feet high. The ride lasts 1 minute. I called the park, told them who I was. I said, can I talk to an engineer or someone who's in charge of your Leap the Dips coaster? So the nice lady put me through and a guy got on and we talked and I told him what I was interested in. I said, I would like to know some of the statistics about your coaster because I'm developing story on its twin that's here. And so he gave me this information and I said, now the key question. If yours is a twin to ours, how fast does yours go? Remember all those interviews, how the car raced around the track, and Hilda's reply, it's the fastest thing I was ever on in my life. Someone once asked me in another presentation like this, did you ever tell her about the beast at Kings Island? And I said, no, it goes 62 miles an hour, but I don't want to spoil her memory. That is the Leap the Dips coaster in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It is a twin to ours. And I was told by an engineer that they have much faster coasters at that park, but this is the most popular one because it's the only wooden coaster. And still open. Mounds Park also contained a 2-story pavilion. It too was situated on the bluff, only a short distance from the roller coaster. In between was a narrow wooden bridge that spanned a small ravine, allowing park goers easy access to both attractions. And you see that bridge here and you see a person on it. Every once in a while, at the Madison County Historical Society, somebody will come in and they'll come back to my office and they'll hand me a picture and they'll say, I don't know what this is, but you may have it if you'd like. That's how I got this picture. As you can see, it is that same bridge, and here is the coaster. And all it did was allow people to go back and forth between the pavilion and the coaster and not have to circumvent the ravine. And then a couple months after I got that picture, I got that one. A restaurant and large dining room were located on the first floor of the pavilion, while the second floor was a dance hall, where dances were held on Friday and Saturday nights. Many visitors brought picnic lunches, but the park contained concession stands. The pavilion housed an ice cream parlor and a restaurant which served hamburgers, hot dogs, and soft drinks, all for a nickel apiece. Sign me up. No liquor was sold or allowed in the park. 2 special officers from the Anderson Police Department were on duty to enforce those park rules. Another photograph of the pavilion. Again, the restaurant was on the first floor. The dance hall was on the second floor. Of course, the building wasn't air conditioned, so the windows were always left open. And in these interviews that I read, many times people would come late afternoon, early evening and picnic in the park and then just sit there and listen to the music that wafted through the park coming from the second floor. Call your attention to this couple seated on this park bench. Those benches are nailed to the tree. Remember that. Another image of the pavilion. It was located right on the bluff, almost a sheer drop to the river. From the May 31st, 1913 Anderson Daily Bulletin, I found this advertisement. Mounds Park, Sunday band concerts, afternoon, evening, boating, baseball, North Anderson, Union Traction Company of Indiana. I wondered, why are they advertising baseball in North Anderson on a Mounds Park? There's a simple answer to that. The Union Traction Company not only owned Mounds Amusement Park, but they also owned another park in Anderson known as Sparks Woods. And it was for their employees only. Today, you know Sparks Woods as Shadyside Park. From a May 27th, 1928 Anderson Herald, this would be the final year of the park's operation. We see that they're going to have a Collins Boys band, a 50-piece band. Another popular attraction was a musical merry-go-round. Located next to the carousel was a place where the rider could reach out and grab a ring. The rings were different colors, but if you got a gold-colored one, you were entitled to a free ride. Okay, you're on a merry-go-round, and here's a post out here, and there's rings hanging on that post. And you lean out and grab a ring, and if you get a gold-colored ring, you get a free ride. The park featured a roller skating rink with wooden floors and music for the skaters. Present one time or another during the park's operation was a shooting gallery, a bowling alley, a penny arcade, and tub swings. Also a monkey cage with live monkeys was there for a short time. Another popular ride was a miniature steam train that circled the Great Mound, then made a loop up and down the Midway. The little locomotive was a scaled-down version of the real thing, weighing 750 pounds and able to travel 20 miles per hour, and we have a picture of it. And ladies, pay attention. We assume it's probably a hot summer day, and they're in a hat and a long skirt, and blouses with sleeves in them. I've been asked what ever happened to that train. I've never been able to verify this, but I was told that over by Mechanicsburg on US 36, a fella had a train layout over there, and that's where that ended up. Can't vouch for that, but that was the story I was told. It did not go to Kilbuck Park, if you remember the one at Kilbuck Park. On Monday, May 30th, 1910, visitors were thrilled when a balloon ascension was made by Frank Crawford of Anderson. After reaching the desired height, he parachuted safely to the ground, leaving his assistant in charge of the balloon. Now I wondered, I don't know that I'd want to be the assistant if the balloon's drifting off. This is a picture taken that day. They're filling the balloon. I was curious, how do you fill a hot air balloon in 1910? As crude as it seems, this is how it was done. A trench was dug, yay deep. Over here was the balloon. Over here was a huge bonfire. The trench was covered. And at the end where the bonfire was, there were people that fanned the hot air, pushing it through the tunnel to fill the balloon. That was the popular, common, and only known way before helium to fill a hot air balloon. Hence the name, hot air balloon. That's Mr. Crawford parachuting from his balloon in 1910. These are really, I think, pretty rare photographs, and somebody was able to capture in 1910 with a camera Mr. Crawford. On July 15, 1928, the Anderson Herald said that Mile High Ruth will do a double parachute leap at Mound State Park Sunday afternoon, July 15th. See this death-defying daredevil using the biggest balloon in Indiana. Come picnic and see the big bag filled. Now, are they talking about Ruth or are they talking about the balloon? Well, you see the picnic and then the big bag filled. Anyway, I got curious. Wonder how she did. That was on Sunday, July 15th. Well, the Herald didn't publish on Monday, July 16th. But they published on Tuesday, July 17th. No mention of Mile High Ruth. They published on Wednesday, July 18th. No mention of Mile High Ruth. I'm starting to worry about Mile High Ruth. Well, I found my answer. You see, due to illness, Mile High Ruth was unable to make the balloon ascension at Mounds Park, advertised for Sunday, July 15th. But Miss Hazel Bruce is going to ride the big balloon during a daring, death-defying double parachute leap at Mounds State Park, Sunday afternoon, July 22nd. Once again, I looked to see if she made it. Didn't find anything, but I assumed that she did. Evidently, their safe return was not newsworthy. One of the first motor domes, which some of you may not know what it is, but it's just a round track for racing cars and motorcycles, in the entire United States, operated in Mounds Park for one season only. And during World War I, there was an attraction called Sock the Kaiser. Now, sometimes I give this to groups who have no idea what the Kaiser is. Do I need to explain that? No. Down here. The Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm, was over Germany in World War I, and he is the one blamed for beginning World War I, like Hitler was blamed for World War II. So the world disliked him, and so they had this feature called Sock the Kaiser, which what it was just a hammer, you sledgehammer, and you hit a platform, and it runs a thing up and hits him in the chin. And apparently that was a real popular attraction for people. A figure of the Kaiser was at the top of the striker pole, and everyone was eager to hit the striker hard enough so that it would send a weight up to give the Kaiser a good stiff jolt. There's a motor dome. And inside the motor dome was motorcycle racing. And you see a woman here driving a motorcycle, but look what she's got in a sidecar. Can you make it out? It's a lion. Yeah. All of this was on the upper level, while down by the river there was more to appeal to the visitor. A dime would get your rowboat or a canoe to take on White River. A rock dam had been built across the river to dam up the water to a depth to allow rental canoe rides. The canoes were launched from a large wharf. Later, flat-bottom boats replaced the canoes as too many tipped over, providing occupants with an unwelcome bath. There again, in all of the interviews that I read, that was one thing I came across many times. Ladies would go to the park on Sunday afternoon in their finest dresses, and many of them ended up in White River unwillingly. Because they would get in one of the canoes and somebody would rock the canoe and they got dumped in the White River. And that ended a perfect day and probably a lot of budding romances. Today's visitor can still see traces of the old dam as a few stones mark its location. It was one man's job to keep the dam built up. This was especially difficult after rains and heavy waters scattered the rocks. It was also this man's job to go upriver and bring back the canoes and rowboats that had been abandoned by the patrons who did not want to pay their overtime fee. You see, you paid to rent the canoe for an hour, which meant you had to have it back in an hour from when you took it. And if you didn't have it back, then you paid an extra fee for it to come when you brought it in. Well, people just figured out, I just won't bring the canoe back, and they just beach it somewhere up the river. So it was that man's job to go and bring the canoe back. The Pest House Bridge was the upper limit. That spark any questions? Pest House. Do you remember years ago, if you took 10th Street east and you went past Geating, you went down the hill and you crossed an old iron bridge. On the other side, it took you in the back way to Chesterfield. This was before State Road 32 was put in. And as you descended that hill to go down to the river, to your left, later was the Tanglewood Girl Scout camp. Earlier, that had been the Ella B. Kerr Tuberculosis Hospital. Before that, it was the county pest house, meaning that if you had a communicable disease and the health officer of Madison County learned of it, you had to go to the pest house. If you were contagious, you could not stay at home. You could not stay in your neighborhood. You had to go there if they found out that you were sick. And so it was labeled the unflattering name, Pest House. Well, that bridge where it was located was the upper limit of the boat rides. Young ladies would decorate their boats as well as themselves and vie for the title of the prettiest. Someone inaugurated a Venetian night, and scores of rowboats and canoes could be seen in the water decorated with strings of colored Japanese lanterns, illuminated by candles. Imagine that. That'd be a pretty sight, wouldn't it? This is that rock dam that I spoke of. You see some fishermen. The river in this area right here, which this is Mounds Park, this river at normal depth is no more than 2 feet, but the dam was put in to raise the water level to 4 feet to give you more, more water to float in. Something that I also read that you'll be interested in many of the accounts, the people in the boats, in the canoes, would say they could see the bottom of the river. Being 4 feet deep, that's not that unusual. But what they did say that I thought was unusual was that the river bottom was white or a gray color, not the way it is today. And that goes back to the time when the Delaware lived here, and they gave the river the name Wapexapoo, meaning at a place where there is much white earth. And you saw that as the title of our next meeting in April, the story of a place where there is much white earth. If you go today behind the Shrine Club along the river and scratch back some of the debris that's there, leaves and so forth, you'll see that same gray colored soil. Gray colored soil. And that extended into the river, and hence the name White River came from that. Picture postcard showing that boat, the boat landing. You see the canoes here and the rock dam. I got a few of these boat landings. You see people taking off. These would be where you rented the boat. All of this is down along the river. If you walk through Mounds Park today, there's a trail that takes you right along the river's edge, and this is where we're at. Even a better picture of it. And yet another. Again, remember, it was one man's job to keep those rocks piled up, because if the rocks broke down, the water level dropped, and that was not a good thing. This is an interesting picture for two reasons. Number one, it shows the replacement of the canoe with these flat-bottom boats. I guess we'd know them as pontoons. With a paddle wheel on the back of it, that became more popular. But the second thing that's interesting in this picture, that the rule of the boat ride was no more than 3 occupants at a time. No more than 3 occupants at a time. Another scene of that era, and another. A large flowing artesian well drinking fountain refreshed all who ventured to the riverbank. A wall was built around the fountain to contain the free-flowing water. On top of the wall were tin cups attached by chains. Everyone was invited to drink from the cooling waters by dipping the cup and drinking until their fill, drinking their fill on a hot summer's day. That wouldn't happen today, would it? Board of Health would never let that happen today. The mineral spring water contained calcium and salts of iron. It was considered a fine tonic and desirable for people suffering from general weakness or impaired indigestion. This is a picture that we have showing that drinking fountain. What it was an artesian well, a free-flowing artesian well, and people would come up and take the tin cups. This is a man and a little girl, presumably a father and daughter, getting their fill. This next picture always makes me laugh. It's obviously a hot day from the paper hats that these ladies have put on their heads. But look how they're dressed. But more importantly, look how wet it is around there, indicating there's been a lot of water consumed. And here in a picture postcard, you see the cups chained to the container. And here you see people gathered around getting a drink. Industrial days were very popular. There were days reserved for exclusive use by the companies for their employees. They would gather in the downtown Anderson, board the open city cars for the ride out Ohio Avenue to the park. Everything was free. Sometimes it was past midnight before the large crowds could get a car back to town. Again, I've read numerous interviews where people would just sit out there patiently, waiting their turn, discussing the events of the day and how much they enjoyed it. And if the car didn't get there till after midnight, so what? This is one of those city cars that the City of Anderson ran out there. It's an open air car. You see the running board on the side. And here is the conductor with his change purse that I'd mentioned to you earlier. A motorman and a conductor, and they're on the way to Mounds Park. I was curious. Wonder when that picture was taken, and I wonder who those two people are. Well, a little investigation revealed that the picture was taken in 1915. The motorman, this man here, is Albert Grant. He's 27, and the conductor is Otis Ellingward, and he's age 35. There were special events too. On July 4th, 1908, a grand celebration for the benefit of the Associated Charities and the industrial school that was once here in Anderson was held. A year later, on July 18th, the Old Fiddlers of Madison County had a contest. That is a carryover from when our pioneers lived here. The pioneers would get together in social gatherings maybe 3-4 times a summer, where they would have a pitch-in picnic on a Sunday afternoon, and they would just exchange information, just like family reunions do today. But always as a part of that, there would be several men with fiddles who would get up and begin to play, and there was always a contest came out of that as to who was the best fiddler. And so this that you see here is nothing more than a carryover from those old days of the fiddlers. And on August the 15th that year, an estimated 20,000 people attended the Old Settlers meeting to witness a sham battle between the Indians and the settlers. Once again, the Old Settlers meetings were those meetings where the people got together. I found here in Madison County that we had Old Settlers meetings. They moved them around different places in the county. One of the more popular places to have it, of course, was Mounds Park, but also Reddles Grove. Reddles Grove is where Grand Avenue, High Street, and University Boulevard all come together just before you cross White River coming into Anderson. That hillside there was Reddles Grove, and that was a popular picnicking area. I find that the last Old Settlers meeting in Madison County was held in 1923. There are counties in Indiana that still have Old Settlers meetings. They came to witness the sham battle between the Indians and the settlers, but look at the attendance, 20,000. Kelly Morgan is the current naturalist at Mound State Park. Great person, doing a great job. I know her well. But I asked her one day, I said, Kelly, have you ever had 20,000 people in this park at one time? She said, oh, I wish. Oh, I wish. Think of that, 20,000 in that park. That was more in 1910 than was Anderson's population. The battle was so popular that it was repeated in July of 1910 under the auspices of the Improved Order of Redmond. The 4th of July festivities always featured fireworks and band concerts. During the 1920s, business declined, and the traction company discontinued service to the park and began to sell the equipment. What could not be sold was torn down near the end of the decade. In 1928, the Madison County Historical Society led the effort to purchase all 256 acres. The rest of the story is this: the Union Traction Company was going to sell Mounds Park. It was actually 4 different groups that owned the land out there. One of those was C.E. Wilson. C.E. Wilson, of course, went on to be head of Remy Electric, went on to be head of General Motors, went on to be Secretary of State under Eisenhower, I believe. But he owned ground there. And about that same time, General Motors had arrived in Anderson in the presence of Delco Remy Division, and soon after, Guide Lamp Division. And they were looking for land upon which their executives could build homes. And that park was an ideal setting. Madison County Historical Society said, that's not going to happen. And they moved in rather quickly. And I can say that because I worked for General Motors, and the Historical Society that time moved a lot faster than the General Motors did, and I'm sure glad of that. Anyway, they led the effort. It's a long story. It's a whole nother program that I do about how that all happened. But the bottom line is they made sure that the county purchased the property. And upon the purchase, the land was then deeded to the county, who in turn gave it to the state of Indiana with the provision that it be made into a state park. And that's how that happened. So, what happened to those executive homes that people wanted to build there? Well, a man by the name of Wade Donnelly had the answer. He said, I live on the west side of Anderson in an area that's rolling and beautiful and trees and so forth. He says, I'm going to call it Edgewood. If you'd like to come out there, we can build home lots out there. And that's how Edgewood got started. And it was populated in the beginning by a lot of General Motors executives. A new purpose. This was accomplished. The park was opened on October 7th, 1930. When it came into existence as we know it today. On that day, a ceremony was held at the Anderson YMCA, where Wilson Newton, president of the Madison County Board of Commissioners, presented the deed to Indiana Governor Harry G. Leslie. Sadly, Charles T. Sansbury, who as president of the Madison County Historical Society started the movement to have the park made part of the state park system, died just 2 weeks prior to the ceremony. He knew it was going to happen, but he didn't live to see it happen. The Historical Society, we have the correspondence at the Historical Society. We wrote to the then Superintendent of State Parks in Indiana, Lieber was his name, and we suggested to him that that state park become a pioneer settlement as an attraction. Put cabins in there and recreate it as a pioneer settlement. Lieber wrote back and he says, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. I don't think we'll do that. Any of you ever been to Conner Prairie? What's there today? The bridge abutments. These supports, I asked the people at the park one day when I was out there, I said, what's down in that gully? And they said, we don't know and we don't want to know. I said, why do you say that? Well, they said there's lots of briars, maybe a few snakes, and some other things we probably don't want to encounter down there, and we don't go down there. So I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. maybe if I wait till January and go down there, I won't have to encounter all that. So that's what I did. Now what I had to do was negotiate my way down this hill to the bottom. The day I chose to go was a snowy day, but I got down there and I took my pictures of these supports, and then I turned around and I looked back up that hill. What goes down must come back up. I was beginning to think that this was my last adventure. But I'm here today, I made it. The passenger shelter, it's gone, but these support posts in the park today, there are along the trail the concrete supports for those, and this is a signage that has this picture on it showing you where that was located. The train rails. The train originally just circled the mound, but then later on they expanded it to go out all through the park. When the park closed, they pulled up the rails, and along one of the trails today, you can see them. This trail now happens to be closed. It's not safe to walk on any longer, but those train rails there came from the train ride. The foundation of the dam attendant's quarters. I told you that the attendant that had to keep this up, they had a house built for him. And he lived in that house all through the summer. Well, the house is gone, but the foundation for his house is still there. And that artesian well drinking fountain, well, all they did was divert it out into the river and turn it upside down. And there it is today. The rock dam looks more like this today. One morning I was out there early, must have been 8 o'clock, doing some work, and something caught my attention. And I looked, and crossing from the park to the other side was a buck, a doe, and 2 fawns, single file, walking across the rocks. And my camera was in the car. Remember I told you about the benches that people sat on? Well, there's one of them that the actual tree bark has grown over. The Pavilion Foundation, when they closed the park, they had to deal with everything that was in there, and the pavilion, the wood was still good. And since it was going to be a state park, the state park would have a superintendent who would live on site. So they just used the wood from the pavilion to build the superintendent's home. The supports for the foundation of the building then were just shoved over this bluff, and today you find them down at the bottom of the bluff. Some of them have made it into the river, and on a clear day when the water is low, you can see a lot of bricks in the water, but this is one of the supports standing there. The roller coaster suffered a little different fate. What do you do with a roller coaster? Well, what they did with it, again, it's right on the river bluff. What they did with it, they brought in bulldozers, and they just shoved it over the side. Just shoved it over the side. So it tumbles down, and today, behind where it was is the debris field. The wood is all gone because it's rotted, but here are the supports that supported the posts for it that are still there today. The side of the wooden bridge that spanned the ravine, well, it's gone, but this is that ravine. Cave marking, we haven't talked about that. There was a beech tree in the park that years ago somebody carved back entrance to cave with an arrow in the beech tree because there was an entrance to the cave there. Kelly Morgan told me a couple years ago that they assumed kids came out there and defaced that whole bark, so that's gone. But speaking of caves, this is an interesting story. If you're ever at the Great Mound, which is where we are today, and after a heavy rain or a snow melt, you will find on this side of it water standing. You will never find water standing on this side. Never. Because the ground is so porous beneath it that the water immediately drains into it and then makes its way towards the river. If you've ever walked the trail down along the river at Mounds Park and noticed how wet the embankment is, it's from the spring water that's underneath here that is eroding all of that and keeping that wet. That is one of the key arguments when the folks that wanted to put in the reservoir, one of the key arguments for those who didn't want the reservoir was that if the lake that would have been out here is up at a certain level, it would undermine all of this and eventually, over time, collapse the Great Mound. The only way you could ever protect that would be build a 75-foot seawall to keep the wave action from eroding underneath the Great Mound. There were 6 caves, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Good friend of mine, Ron Wyatt is his name. He was a docent, a guide in the park for years and knew the park forwards and backwards. He took me out there many times. He lives in Portland, Oregon now, but for a while he would come back to Anderson to visit his wife's family, and every year he came back, we'd take a walk through the park and he'd point things out to me. And he was a great teacher, but when he was out there, the fellows that worked with him, they determined where the cave openings were. You see, a story is told of an 11-year-old girl by the name of Frances Norton getting lost in one of those caves. She wandered away from the family and decided to do some exploring. They were out there on a Sunday afternoon for a picnic. Taking a box of kitchen matches, she crawled about 60 feet into a cave on her hands and knees. She was able to stand when she came upon a large cavern, in the middle of which was a deep, seemingly bottomless pit. Skirting the pit, the cavern narrowed again, and this time into a larger tunnel. Hearing the sound of falling water, she became frightened, and using her last match, was unable to go on or find her way back. Well, the family was frantic, and so a search was set out, and one man noticed that she'd entered the cave early in the afternoon, and when she did not return, a search party was formed, and one man noticed a burned match near the entrance of the cave, went in, and she was rescued. So it had a happy ending. But the decision was made, that can't happen again, and so those caves were all dynamite closed, all of them. This is what they look like. You can see some of them various sizes. Look at the size of this one. All of those caves, incidentally, are there because of the water that drains down and erodes on its way to the river from the upper level. Again, this is the Ron's map of those caves. Cave number 5 is the one in which Frances Norton was lost. We went out there several times over the summers, and we noticed here that cave number 6, he named it the Raccoon Cave. But the first time we went out there, well, it was about like that. And as the summers went on, it grew. So Mother Nature is reclaiming her caves. Interesting picture dated 1911. I call your attention to something that's unusual in the park. You probably don't notice it, but that is an electric wire. Throughout the park, it was lighted at night. Think how pretty that would be to walk through that park in the nighttime and it'd be all lit up. We know that because of these old light bulbs and insulators that are now on display in the museum or visitor center. And if you know where to look, you'll find them along the trees. Creating memories. A family picnicking at Mounds Park. I assume the brown bottles are root beer. Martha gave me this picture and two other pictures of her dad. She says that was taken in 1915 in a canoe there at Mounds Park, and she wanted me to have it. And so I asked her, I said, "That's your dad?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Is that your mom?" "Heavens no, I don't know who that is." So we didn't say any more about that. This is Christine Reynolds and Jean Drennan. And they're on a date somewhere in Mounds Park in the year 1920. And they got married. And this photo is courtesy of their daughter Jane. She gave it to me. And she gave it to me at Mound State Park when I was doing this presentation for the guests at the Mound State Park, August 27th, 2016. The American Steel and Wire Company picnic, summer of 1910. As I told you, it was very popular for businesses, factories, and so forth to have picnics out there. In the picture is a baby in a carriage. It's 1910. You know who that is?
Mrs. Anderson.
Pardon me?
Mrs. Anderson.
It is Mrs. Anderson. I told you when I interviewed her, she was 99. She had her 100th birthday at the Lutheran Church on 53rd Street, and she invited my wife and I to come to the celebration, which we did, and she was the biggest duck in the pond that day. She lived to be 103, dying in 2013. At one point in time, she was the Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade in in Chesterfield. So I dedicate this to her and her memory. Lovely lady. Never met a person that had a mind like that. The final picture I have for you today is a cabin. Was built in 1832 by a man by the name of Daniel Nolan. It sat south of Chesterfield for a number of years. And in 1932, 100 years after it was built, the Madison County Historical Society was still pushing for the state to make Mound State Park, which had only been in operation 3 years at that point, to make it a pioneer settlement. Cabin was empty. We said we'd like to purchase it. Deal was worked out, $20. Our Historical Society treasury, which is never flush with money, but I looked up in 1932 to see what our balance was at the time of the purchase. We had $11.40 in our treasury. $11.40. One of the members coughed up the $20, and we purchased the cabin. We hired somebody to take it apart and number it, haul it over to the park, Mound State Park, and reassemble it. And that cabin was used for years in the park. It's right out in front of where the riding stables used to be. And it was used for concessions. It was used for lots of reasons. It's not there today, and I wondered, what happened to it? Looking back through some of our records, I find that in some minutes of a society meeting in January of 1972, it was mentioned that the cabin was no longer because of termites. So it's gone. And with that, I've come to the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a whole different look at Mounds Park, and the next time you go, you'll look at it differently than you have before.